Okay, continuing on with regulation of sexual behavior. Let's talk about informal regulation, and the way we often classify these is as social norms. We'll talk more about that. So think about all of the messages you receive and have received over time and will continue to receive about how you are supposed to behave sexually, right? Messages that you get from your family growing up and still now, things that you get from media, films, and television. What are the messages you get from your friends and your peers? What about your community at large, right? What about your religious community if you're part of one? And so there's all these different messages, right? And a lot of them are sometimes in direct conflict with each other. So, like, what are you supposed to do? So, right, so this is an example of a purity ball, right? So many religious communities or local communities will put a lot of importance on a female-bodied person not having sex until not becoming sexually active until they are married, right? So staying pure for whatever that means. And so there's oftentimes a lot of ritual tied into that, and a lot of importance placed on that in many cultures for reasons that we've talked about before, right? Then you get something like this. Let me get my head out of the way, right? Where it's like, oh no, you're supposed to be kind of simultaneously looking like a little girl and like a steamy sex pot. I mean, it's just like, okay, so on the one hand, you're supposed to be virginal and pure and chaste, and on the other hand, you're supposed to be desirable and sexy and perky and somehow like a woman and like a child, yet all at the same time. So all of these different messages, right? Here's another one, right? So this idea of kind of the Madonna whore complex, right? So we we kind of have this double standard for women that they're not supposed to want to have sexual desires. If they are, they're a whore, right? They're trashy, they have no class, they're promiscuous, they're a slut. But then sometimes too, if they're not sexually active, then we'll say, well, maybe not that you're the Madonna and you're the paragon of female virtue. Maybe you're uptight. Maybe you're frigid, right? So it's like, oh, you just can't really win here. Um, and so the classic is the movie Grease, which has incredible dance and song numbers in it and is fabulous for that reason. But if you kind of look at the message behind the movie, for those of you who know it, so Sandy, our main character, the whole trajectory of the film is that in order to get the guy, she has to stop being a goody two-shoes and turn into a slut, right? That's the happy ending of the story. So we have all these kind of crazy messages we get about how you're supposed to be, especially if you're a female-bodied person. But we also have lots of other messages, right? So that women in general are just sex objects, that the worth of a female-bodied person is just as somebody to have sex with, how attractive they are, how sexy they are, how accommodating they are, right? And this is demeaning, right, to women. And right, she has no agency in this picture. She's not in control of her sexuality, right? She's made herself completely subservient to, in this case, the camera. But this image of women is just sex objects, right? And again, you know, it's all about how good you can be in bed, right? That determines your worth as a woman in many ways in our current culture. And it even goes so far sometimes as to glorify, when you take a look at this image, right? This kind of looks like a scene from a gang rape, right? So we're constantly bombarded with all of these images. I think they say the average person sees something like 1,000 media advertisements per day. And these influence the way we think about ourselves and the people around us. We do it to men too, right? So here's Jacob from the Twilight series of movies, right? So men have to be very hunky and built and, very muscular and well developed. And then if they're not, or if they're not studs who've had a lot of sexual partners, then we make fun of them, right? As dweebs and, the 40-year-old virgin and all these types of things. So we also have these kind of impossible expectations for male-bodied people as well. Not a lot of allowance for just being a human with all of our flaws. So these things work together to create social norms, right? This is your idea of what's typical and what's acceptable. So human beings are, let me come back to make it, I don't know, maybe this makes it more interesting or interactive. I don't know if you see my head. Okay, so we're really social animals, and we base our behavior off of the behaviors of the people around us. We see this all the time in many different facets of behavior. So it's not, in today's media saturated world, it's not just what the people around you actually are doing, it's also what you think everybody else is doing, which is to a large extent shaped by your media exposure, right? So you can think for a minute and try to think, what are some of the movies or TV shows or ads, memes, other things that have really shaped your generation's views on sexual behavior. For my generation, the movie Grease was one of them, right? Um, as was Little House on the Prairie, right? So, we have all these different types of ideals kind of put upon us. So what are the things that have kind of shaped your expectations or ideas about what everybody's doing and what's acceptable and what's normal or typical? All right. So these are what we call social norms. And so what we do in class, and so those of you who are in class will know this, I'm going to ask you what percentage of college students you think in the past year have been sexually active in any way. They've had oral, vaginal, or anal sex. And of those, right, overall, how many college students have had 4 or more partners in the past year? How many have had vaginal sex, and how many have had anal sex in the past year? So if you weren't able to come to class and you're doing this at home, right, you're going to write down what you think, what your best guesses are for the answers to these questions. Let's see how we do. Okay. So this is actual surveys of college students. So the American College Health Association does this every year or two, and they survey tens of thousands of college students about their behaviors, and they ask about a lot of things, including sex. Let me get my head out of the way. So this first question, they're asking college students how many sexual partners they've had within the past year. Now, this particular question includes oral sex as sex. So even if you just performed oral sex on somebody, that would count as a sexual partner. So let's see what kinds of answers they got. So you might be surprised. About 33% of college students said they had had 0 sexual partners for oral, vaginal, or anal sex within the past year. So that means on the flip side that only 67% of them, which is still more than half, right? But 67% of them had some type of these sexual contacts. So I always point this out to people because when I teach this course, I meet many students who are not sexually active and they feel like they're the only one. But I'm here to tell you that actually about a third of college students are not sexually active. All right, that is normal. Okay. So of those remaining, right, the vast majority have just had 1 partner in the past year, so about 43% overall. 10% have had 2, 6% have had 3, and about 9% overall have had 4 or more partners in the past year. So take a look at what you thought the answer to 4 or more partners in the last year was, and compare that to the true number, which is 9%, right? And think about why, if you were right, or if you were close, why you were right or close, and if you weren't, why not? Okay. These are the answers to the other questions. Now, the way they asked it is kind of weird. So they only asked this question of those people who already said they'd had a sexual partner, which was only 67% of all students. And then they asked whether they'd done it at all, and never, or within the last 30 days, right? So this first one is oral sex. Let me just get a little pen color here. So, 31% of college students said they have not had oral sex in the last year. And some of them, about 27%, said they had oral sex, but not in the last 30 days. And then 42% of that 67% said they had done this in the last 30 days. So this table is the primary data, but it's a little bit difficult to interpret. So I kind of fixed that for you in the next slide. Okay, so out of every 100 students in this survey, you'll remember that 33 of them, 33%, were not sexually active, no oral, vaginal, or anal sex. 67% were. Of those 67, right, we have the following different behaviors. So out of 100 students total, 46 have had oral sex. So that means 46% of college students have had oral sex in the past year. That's fewer than half. 44% have had vaginal sex. Again, fewer than half. And 15% have had anal sex. And what's interesting, and I forgot to kind of point it out to you on the previous slide, and when I'm recording it doesn't let me go backwards, but both male and female-bodied people engage in anal sex. So sometimes people think it's just for gay men, but it's not. There are several reasons why female-bodied people do engage in anal sex. One of them is just because they enjoy it. Another is because there's less risk of pregnancy. And then another is that in some kind of belief traditions or perhaps personal coping mechanisms, some people feel that having anal sex, you're still a virgin if you haven't had vaginal sex. So some people will have anal sex because they feel like they're still a virgin as long as they haven't had vaginal sex. So those are the actual numbers. Well, how did you do, right? Were you close? Were you not close? And why, right? Why do you think your numbers, your responses were the way they were? And so this whole concept of social norms and we're kind of just brainwashed almost by the media that we're surrounded by, and we are also very much informed by the people with whom we are close. So if the people with whom you are close are engaging in behaviors that are very different from the rest of the population, you may assume that that is normal. So here is more data from the study, just kind of showing that a lot of times people's perceptions are very far off from reality. This is about alcohol use. And so over here on the right-hand side, they asked the college students, how many people do you think have had alcohol in the last 30 days? And students said they thought on average 94% of college students had alcohol in the last 30 days. The true number is 64%, right? So again, just like with sex, you think everybody's having sex, you think everybody's drinking in college? Not at all, right? So more than 20% of college students don't drink alcohol at all, right? And the vast majority of those who do, right, either they haven't had anything to drink at all in the last month, or they've only had drinks on anywhere from 1 to 9 days, okay? So if you know someone or you are someone yourself who is drinking between 10 and 29 out of 30 days, or all 30 days, right, every day, you are in the very small majority, right? You're way up there, way beyond everybody else in terms of your alcohol use. So you might want to take a look at that. Similarly, they asked people about marijuana use, and I love this one. Now, this data was before, this one was actually, I haven't updated this since Colorado changed their law. So students thought that 85% of college students were getting high. And the reality was that fewer than 20% were, right? So a lot of times our perceptions and reality don't match up. it's our perceptions that often end up driving our behavior. Okay. So we've talked about external factors now in terms of sexual regulation, the formal ones, which are religion and laws. And then we just spent time talking about informal regulation, right? This kind of social norming that happens because of media, peers, parents, family, community, your religious community, all those types of things. And then another factor that's really important that we're going to talk about in the next mini section is consent. So that's coming up next.